5.
Total mismanagement. I mean, they should just have said we won't be releasing any violent criminals.
4.
I still can't get my head around the fact that we're not going to have a leader until early November. Crikey.
3.
The car market is absolutely critical because, with the exception of a very small area in the centre of London, the British public rely on cars to do everything that they enjoy about life.
2.
Bunging yet more money as investment or indeed terrible waste as we see it in the NHS.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Into its third month now, this Labour government's accused of paying for train drivers' inflation-busting pay deals by abolishing the winter fuel allowance for millions of vulnerable pensioners. How did Keir Starmer get into this mess? The economy's stalling, flatlining in July, registering no growth for the second successive month. And that's before Rachel Reeves' tax rises, due to be announced in her late October budget statement. Labour says it wants to encourage economic growth, not least because that's how to fix the public finances. So how does piling more taxes on an already weak economy encourage growth? Isn't it likely to make the public finances even worse? Thousands are meanwhile being made redundant in Port Talbot, Allison, your Welsh spiritual homeland. Is UK steelmaking, our ability to make high-quality steel, being sacrificed on the altar of green politics? And the Tories are still on course to deliver a new leader only in early November, after that crucial Reeves autumn statement. Mel Striders followed Priti Patel out the door in the latest round of voting among Tory MPs, with Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch still the two out in front. You've written this week, Allison, about Labour's prisoner early release scheme, which has seen some pretty dangerous people back in the community before completing their sentences. Lots to discuss as ever, Allison, but before we get going, let's have a quick weight loss update. I know you're itching to tell me more about what you've dubbed Fatty's Little Helper.
When are you going to stop enjoying this? That's what I want to know.
We haven't got to the scores on the doors yet. You might be pleased. Go on, get on with it.
Well, one Planet Normal listener wrote in to say that it's much easier for men to lose weight than women. So I think we may have to give you some kind of handicap. It's going really well, Liam. It's going really well. 1/2 stone down.
Wow.
I know, not too bad. Going to the gym twice a week to do weights because that's supposed to build your muscle. And the one concern hanging over, I mean, I'm on Mounjaro, but there are other drugs are available, and muscle wastage is one of the potential issues as you lose weight.
Are you doing any yoga? Are we seeing any Pearson downward dog?
It's not that bad. Upward cat is mainly what we do in our house.
Crikey, says Mrs. Slocum.
I said in my update in the column this week, because I'm doing a sort of every so often, I'm just going to tell readers how I'm getting on. And I said that I was on one of these weights machines. You know, the one where your knees are up to your chin and you've got to push against this board. It's like sort of doing squats lying down. And I said that the day after I was walking like Dick Emery in high heels.
You are awful, but I like you.
I think there's an entire cohort of listeners who'll think, Dick who? But anyway.
We know. If you know, you know.
It was in the days when you could still laugh at men in dresses. We've got some emails later. A few Planet Normal listeners thinking Alison's totally lost the plot, not the common sense co-pilot that we like.
The 10 grand cat, now she's got fatty drug pills.
Exactly. Yes, but I'm still maintaining that if something helps you to become healthier, lots of people take drugs, Liam, for other reasons, don't they? Which aren't to do with getting healthier. And I don't take those. So, you know, each to their own poison. But as you said at the top, I mean, it's been a super packed week. And I think the Labour comms team may not be...
They want to hear about my weight loss.
Oh, okay. All right. What have we done this week?
You'll be pleased. I'm being chivalrous.
Yes.
By reinserting it into our discussion before you ploughed on.
Sorry, go on.
Right, when our competition started, you on fatty drugs, me not, me Eau Sauvage Rambo.
Yes.
Cold turkey.
Yes.
I was 118 kilos.
Right.
And in the face of your challenge,
yes,
I've got up to 119. But it could have been worse. Right, on you go with the news of the week.
That's just putting your coat on because it's autumn, isn't it, really?
That's it.
Yeah, news of the week. I mean, I think for me, the picture or indeed the footage of the week was this unbelievable scenes outside prisons. 1,700 lags were being let out on this early release scheme because our prisons are full to overcrowded with all these keyboard warriors who said something unfortunate that the Labour government disapproved of. So they've had to make room for all the sort of Barrys and Jeffs. So out they came, pouring out of the front gate of these prisons. And honestly, Liam, it was like sort of A-level celebrations, wasn't it? Sort of champagne corks popping. It looked can you imagine people around the country what they would have thought looking at those photographs?
It does seem a bit strange, Allison. You'd have think the prisoners would have been released in the dead of night in dribs and drabs round the back, but the press seems to have been tipped off. There was some kind of celebratory attitude, which will really stick in the craw of some of the women that you've written about in your column. Whatever you think about Labour's actions in the midst of the riots and putting people in prison, as you say, for putting things on social media and so on, among other transgressions, some of the people they're letting out really are quite dangerous people.
Yeah, it was unbelievable because Starmer said to the BBC, we're not letting out any high-risk prisoners. I mean, that man lies as soon as he opens his mouth. And then we're told by senior government sources that there were domestic abusers who were being let out. And we heard from some extremely distressed women who knew suddenly that these guys who had been absolutely appalling to them were to be back on the streets, giving them next to no notice. And there was, again, from the Justice Minister, Shabana Mahmood, who I quite like, actually, but she's obviously been given this hand grenade from Rishi, hasn't she, which is that the prisons are full, there's no room. She was trying to deliver some sort of statement saying, yes, but we're not releasing any of the above and the list of the above. And then she said, there are no non-fatal throttlers or something. And I thought, yeah, that's
reassuring.
I mean, it's, again, total mismanagement. I mean, they should just have said, we won't be releasing any violent criminals. That's what they should have said. But there's nobody. So with that, and just to make the point as well, Liam, that something I wrote about in my column this week, there are well over 10,000 FNOs, that's foreign national offenders, in British jails. And you might think that they try to repatriate some of those. And I did a little bit of digging around, and there are certain countries that won't cooperate, and they are responsible for the bulk of the foreigners in British jails: Pakistan, Jamaica, and Romania.
That's 10% of our prison population.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely huge. And people may remember that Suella Braverman, one of the Stelia Home Secretaries, managed to get rid of an absolute shed-load of Albanian gangsters by giving Albania large sacks of cash. And that was, that did prove that with enough will, it is possible to do that. But again, something I raised in the column, I think that we know, Kemi Badenoch said recently that a lot of Home Office staff, she said they're not really civil servants, they're activists. Many of them have been employed straight from refugee charities. And I think we could say, Liam, that some of them are not very highly motivated to be repatriating people or indeed to be protecting the British public. Just a stat that jumped out at me was how many asylum seekers the UK takes in comparison with France. So France's grant rate is 27% and Britain's grant rate for asylum seekers is 57%. So we take double. Why do we take double? Well, I think we can have some theories about that. But yeah, I mean, obviously this looked very bad for Labour, and this is coming on top of the other thing, which is the absolute crisis that has been made of the winter fuel allowance. What do you make of it?
I do think it's odd that they announced the means testing of the winter fuel allowance as a kind of standalone totemic issue, almost made a symbol of it, almost put up a flag and said to the Labour left, attack us. And of course, they've had a bit of a bloody nose in the Commons. The measure went through, but 50-odd Labour MPs abstained, which is quite symbolic. I think a more serious problem for Labour is the lack of economic growth. We've had 2 months now of zero economic growth. Now, these monthly figures are very, very volatile. And in the 3 months to July, the economy still grew by about 0.5%, which is pretty mediocre, but by no means anywhere near recession territory or anything like that. But the slowdown in growth does make it harder to make the public finances add up as Rachel Reeves approaches this crucial budget on October the 30th. So the policy problems are mounting for Labour, not just on winter fuel allowance, but on things like net zero. We've seen a real upsurge at the trade union conference, albeit barely covered. But there is a lot of concern among union leaders about net zero policies, the impact of those on North Sea oil operations. The GMB has been very vocal about that. Gary Smith, their leader, is taking no prisoners. You've seen concern from the trade unions also about the impact of Labour's commitment to bringing forward the ban on petrol and diesel cars to 2030 from 2035, where it currently is, the impact of that on our automotive industry. And we'll be hearing about that later in this episode of Planet Normal. And also the NHS. I know Lord Darcy's report caught your eye, Allison. Labour have in Wes Streeting a health secretary who is at least saying the right things in terms of being prepared to look at how we run the NHS better, maintaining free at the point of use, but bringing in more competition, bringing in more reforms that mean we get more bang for our economic buck. We've obviously got, as we've often said on Planet Normal, with regret, but backed by factual analysis, that the UK unfortunately has had some of the worst health outcomes in the OECD for many years when it comes to oncology, heart disease, strokes, the big three aspects of medical outcomes. What did you think of this report? Because it's almost slipped under the radar, yet Lord Darcy is a pretty significant person.
Yes, he is. Can I just slip in my Velma stat of the week?
Go on then. You're like a mix between Velma and Wonder Woman these days. I mean, crikey.
I am. You know how I like to truffle up some obscure data that no one's really interested in. But anyway, sapphires in the mud, as T.S. Eliot used to say. I do think that there may well have been a case for means testing the winter fuel allowance. I mean, the thing I found out this week, which I thought was quite astonishing, was that British pensioners living abroad claimed last year 18.5 million in winter fuel allowance. Well, if you're living in Fuengirola, do you really need your 300 quid? And we should remember, Liam, that there was a big hoo-ha when the child benefit, which used to be a universal benefit, and that then became means tested because wealthy parents were spending the child benefit on holidays and trampolines and so on. So there was some kind of case with this winter fuel allowance. And just finally, this is fascinating. I thought you'd like
I knew lots of chaps that spent theirs on a good case of wine.
Yes, exactly.
Laying it down for future generations.
Personally, I think an alcohol budget for anyone trying to raise children in this day and age is the least they can bloody well do. But yes, Rachel Reeves admitted, this is incredible. So there are believed to be 880,000 pensioners who are poor pensioners. Now, people who are hard up, right, who are not claiming the pensions credit. And as we know, Liam, that could be because people are proud. Lots of that generation don't want handouts, or it could well be that they just don't know. And I was amazed to discover that once you're on the pension credit, you're entitled to all sorts of goodies like free TV licenses and so on. But Rachel Reeves has admitted that if all of those 880,000 pensioners who are eligible to claim the pension credit did claim them, it would wipe out the annual saving of 1.5 billion,
wow,
which she was hoping to raise from the winter fuel allowance. So really, the numbers don't add up. And I think Rachel Reeves is coming across as a very, very unsympathetic sort of Dalek-like figure. And I predict she'll get very, very unpopular. But we're both interested in this Lord Darcy report, which will be...
Surgeon, former health minister
under Gordon Brown, indeed. And this is being published as Planet Normal is going out on Thursday morning, commissioned by Wes Streeting, who the minute he became health secretary declared that the NHS was broken. And look, it's not new to those of us who've been looking at the NHS for some time, but Lord Darcy stating this very boldly. The NHS fails those who need it most. A&E waiting times for children and the elderly are absolutely appalling. The average A&E waiting times for the elderly, Liam, have doubled in 15 years. So pensioners can now expect to wait almost 6 hours. Remember, I waited 6.5 hours the other day, but I'm I'm not 80 in casualty units, and that's up from less than 3 hours in 2008. And Lord Darzo warns that the NHS progress is going backwards with cutting deaths from heart disease. That's now in reverse. Now, for me, Liam, and for us, I think for Planet Normal listeners, something that really is a bit of a breakthrough from this report is he is saying it's the first time someone has admitted what we've been saying on Planet Normal for over 4 years, the way that swathes of routine healthcare activity was halted during the pandemic. Other countries did, quotes, far better in continuing to run services. And we warned, didn't we, Liam? We're now seeing this 8 million plus waiting list. And we've always said that was largely down to the NHS becoming a COVID-only service, absurdly, dangerously, lethally, many people now extremely ill with cancer and other diseases because they simply couldn't access a doctor. And it's very important.
All those screenings that didn't happen, just mindless.
Absolutely mindless. And doctors listeners who were living in France, Italy, Germany, were saying they could easily see their doctor. And why was that, Liam? Well, let's take a guess, because British GPs get money from how many patients they've got on their list. They don't have to see the patients to get the money. The money just comes with how many people are on the list. Foreign GPs have to see the patient to be paid. So what we saw was the NHS management panicking and succumbing indeed to groupthink. And where is Amanda Pritchard, CEO of the NHS, the hundreds of NHS managers earning more than the Prime Minister? And if the NHS was a major company, the stacking up of these appalling treatment of what are the customers would see the entire management team sacked. Now, I'm interested because, Labour, we've said before, Labour probably has the best chance of carrying out NHS reform. The NHS is Labour's baby, isn't it? So is this going to be a time with Lord Darzo of a truthful reckoning that we need to copy other systems with mixed provision of funding and so on? Or is it going to be bunging yet more money as investment or indeed terrible waste as we see it in the NHS?
I think it is an interesting report that's almost been lost in a news tsunami of everything else. Even Keir Starmer said in response, Lord Darzy's diagnosis and my conclusion is that the only way out of this is now reform with a small r, not Nigel Farage's party. So the rhetoric is going in the right direction. But of course, the NHS is a behemoth of 1 million plus employees, many of them very powerful, not least the doctors and nurses, and they don't like being reformed. They don't like being pushed around. They don't like being told what to do, not least by a Labour government. It's going to be very, very difficult. But I guess we shall see in the months to come whether Labour is serious or not about that. I suspect there's going to be so much going on in the next few months that NHS reform will become something else that's kicked into the long grass.
Do you, though? Because my strong sense now is we are reaching a tipping point, because I think more and more people have experienced the dire conditions. Professor Pat Price, our Planet Normal friend, one of the country's leading radiologists, Professor Carol Sikora, one of the country's leading oncologists, these people are saying that this is not, it's beyond a crisis. Younger people are dying unnecessarily.
But Labour won't have the guts to roll up their sleeves and try doing painful reforms. They'll just find a way to throw more money at it, which of course will be a very short-term fix, no fix at all, really. I don't think the crisis is going to go away. The likelihood is, unfortunately, that it may well get worse. But Labour is just going to respond in terms of cash. They're not going to have any truck, I think, in the end, despite what Wes Streeting says, of actually making reforms that drive productivity and try and make our healthcare system as efficient as many others across the continent, which maintain free at the point of use healthcare access. That's the key thing. Reform does not mean going the American route of no free at the point of use. We have to get beyond that in our politics. It seems that Labour now is. They're talking about reform without compromising free at the point of view. So that is a breakthrough, but it's just a rhetorical breakthrough. I don't think it's going to lead to any sort of practical administrative breakthroughs, particularly not with the trade unions now with the Labour government where they want them. Talking of which, Tory leadership. We've had Priti Patel and Mel Stride out, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch at the top. I still can't get my head around the fact that we're not going to have a leader until early November. Crikey.
It does seem terribly self-indulgent, doesn't it?
A full month after the Tory conference. I see why they have to wait until the conference in early October, but not until early November. Sorry.
No, I think that, as we have thought, Robert Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch, very much the front runners, and that feels right to me. I think Kemi's been very impressive, taking her engineers approach. I mean, we're going to need a major reboot of the country. I think everything top-down reform, civil service and so on. And I think she wrote a very impressive piece in the Sunday Telegraph. I'm sure you've seen it. Net zero is gifting our future to an increasingly dominant China. We want somebody highly intelligent and practical like her to start picking holes in these entirely preposterous net zero, unachievable and preposterous net zero plans, which we're going to come back to later. Robert Jenrick has really impressed me, Liam, and I think that Robert who was a former immigration minister, has correctly identified that immigration, both legal and illegal, is now the dominant issue. It was always the dominant issue for Tory members and Tory voters. But since the horrific massacre of little girls in Southport, it has sprung to the top of the concerns of all voters. And Jenrick's talking about a cap. He's talking about leaving the CHR. I think the suggested cap is 100,000. So I'm looking forward, not often you can say, I'm looking forward to the speeches at the Tory party conference. That's like looking forward to root canal work. But they are going to be strutting their stuff. And I think a lot of minds will be made up over those few days. But talking about immigration, Liam, I think for me, the week's biggest story, funnily enough, which probably hasn't quite made the headlines that it should have done, but will, is this shock decision by Germany to impose full border controls across all its land borders to, quote, stop the continuing burden of irregular migration and the acute dangers posed by Islamist terror. Now, as you know, Liam, Germany is in the Schengen area, freedom of movement in the EU. That's a totemic pillar of Schengen and the EU. And what we are seeing this week is a leftist coalition government, that's the SPD. Now, they've said for years that no control of migration in and out of Germany was possible. And I think this now is showing what can happen when democracy punches you in the kisser. What do you make of it, Halligan?
The reality is that the Schengen Agreement has been diluted for years and years and years. Ever since 2015, various countries within the EU, including Germany, have closed their borders at various points. So Schengen as a sort of sacred principle, one of the four freedoms, if you like, of the European Union, has been flouted for quite a long time. But for Germany to announce this, it's very different. The politics of it are very, very different. Clearly, Scholz is very, very unpopular, as you say. There are big elections coming up. They're for a couple of election cycles now, the centre ground of German politics, the CDU on the right, the SPD on the left, they've kind of formed grand coalitions to try and keep AfD out. But AfD now are winning, big elections. We've just seen a very big state local election victory for them. And now the German mainstream is having to sacrifice, EU niceties. They're having to expose some of the myths underpinning the EU, that there's freedom of movement always and everywhere, and shout from the rooftops about them in order to placate their own domestic population, not least in the east of the country. As I've often said, this is partly about immigration. The pace of it in Germany is also partly about the German establishment's foreign policy towards the Russia-Ukraine war, which goes down very badly in former East Germany, where AfD are so strong, though there are quite a few AfD strongholds in the west of Germany too. So this is a major change in the rhetoric of the EU's biggest, most powerful member and ultimately its paymaster. And this is a major turning point, I would say, when it comes to how the big EU countries, Germany and France, view the EU, putting EU rhetoric and principles above and beyond domestic politics. That's now changing. That is now changing. And it's a slippery slope now, I would say, towards much, much more EU bashing, effectively, even by the EU's biggest and pivotal members.
Well, it could be a domino effect, couldn't it? We could see it triggering Schengen's collapse. Now, here's something, co-pilot. So 10 days ago, Germany deported 28 hardened criminals to Afghanistan after secret talks with the Taliban. And among those deportees were an Afghan man found guilty of raping an 11-year-old girl, another who took part in a notorious gang rape, and they are also about to start deportations to Syria. Now, Germany, co-pilot, is a member of the ECHR.
Yep.
And the ECHR is always cited as a barrier to us, isn't it?
Yep.
In the UK, oh no, we can't possibly kick out. By some, but still, it crops up a lot. We can't do that because of the ECHR. We've got the British legal class always saying, oh no, we can't do that. But clearly, Germany has gone ahead and done it, putting her national interests first. Now, I'll tell you something that has always bugged me, Liam, and it's almost unsayable, but it has to be said. And what has to be said is that importing thousands of young men from cultures which have no respect for women, which are misogynist cultures. Look now what's happening in Afghanistan. Women aren't allowed to speak. They aren't allowed to sing. So we have got these horrifically women-hating cultures, and many young men from those countries are arriving in the UK. And do they ditch their horrible attitudes at Dover? I don't think so. And this caught my eye. This guy, Merz, leader of the opposition in Germany, and he spoke. This is a centrist party, okay? This isn't a right-wing party. Merz spoke of young migrant men's complete lack of respect for German women, and he suggested they are partly responsible for the nation's horrifying increase in gang rapes. Now, such talking points would have been unthinkable coming from the party of Angela Merkel only recently. This is huge. This is Europe now really looking what are the implications of mass migration, and what a concern that's really, really bothered me for a long time. What is the impact on the safety of women and girls?
Last week, Planet Normal welcomed Ian Cox, former Chief of Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service, who provided expert insights into the Grenfell fire tragedy. This week, too, we're reaching beyond the bubble, talking to leading entrepreneur Robert Forrester, co-founder and CEO of Vertu Motors, launched in 2006 and now operating 192 car dealerships from its headquarters in the Northeast. Robert's among a growing number of senior figures from the UK's sizable automotive industry, suppliers, manufacturers and retailers alike, raising concerns about the upcoming ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2035, a date Labour is committed, of course, to bringing forward to 2030. There's growing evidence the slow take-up of electric vehicles, leading to growing fines on sales of petrol and diesel cars, is curtailing the UK car market. There are credible fears across the industry, says Robert Forrester, that a flood of Chinese EV imports, sparked by the upcoming ban, could kill off large parts of the UK car industry, which employs upwards of 1 million people. I started by asking Robert Forrester about the importance of the UK car market.
The car market is absolutely critical because, with the exception of a very small area in the centre of London, the British public rely on cars to do everything that they enjoy about life, going to the beach. And then clearly it's crucial for people to get to work. So people need cars. Old people actually have access to mobility through cars and hate it when they give the car up. and 17-year-olds desperately want to get their hands on a car, rightly or wrongly, because it gives them an immense amount of freedom. So cars are critical to the functioning of the economy, but actually it's a big part of the economy in itself. I mean, clearly the UK leads in terms of R&D because of F1 investment around Silverstone, and most of the teams are based here, and then it cascades all the way down into production. A lot of the major manufacturers of R&D facilities here, cars are designed here, and then they're made here. And clearly the UK public is the second biggest market in Europe for cars, for new cars. And we also have a vibrant van market. You know, everyone has 5 deliveries a day, don't they? And that's normally done through a van. So the whole economy of the automotive sector employs well over 1 million people. There's no question about that.
And the car market, Robert, while it's up this year, 3.4% on 2023, according to the industry body, the SMMT, it's still 15% smaller than before lockdown. Tell us about your concerns about the UK car industry, particularly in light of the government's net zero policies, because you've started speaking out along with some other senior figures in the international car trade.
I remember when I first read the government's policy actually around what they call the zero emission mandate and the way they were going to push, and I use the word push, electric vehicles as the chosen technology. And actually on first reading you think, this is interesting. And actually you refer to the new car market. It's not actually a market anymore, actually. It's not willing buyers, willing sellers. The state has imposed itself into the new car market and will do similarly with regards to vans to, I'll use the word advisedly, coerce a large percentage of the buying public into buying electric vehicles. Now, I've got nothing wrong with electric vehicles. I've actually got an electric vehicle. But the targets that have been set and the punitive fines that have been put in place by the UK government are well in advance of what's expected in other European countries and well in advance of what's expected in America. We have gone straight to the front of the queue, and the market is not going to deliver anything like the growth in electric vehicles that the government wants. And reality is starting to impose itself on an idealistic situation prepared by the government. And we're now seeing, I mean, just to give you an example, I was in Dunfermline yesterday on Fife. I've got 15 petrol new cars sat waiting to be delivered to the customers. I will not be able to deliver them to the customers this month. Because if I do, the mix of cars between electric and petrol will not hit the government's targets. So the manufacturer will ultimately face fines of £15,000 for every car that I deliver that's petrol or diesel or hybrid above the government's targets. £15,000 a car, which is an astonishing amount of money. So I'm being incentivized by the manufacturers not to deliver cars.
To be clear, because you're not selling enough electric vehicles, the share of petrol and diesel vehicles you'd be selling would be too high. So you can't sell the petrol and diesel vehicles either. So you've got complete gridlock.
And it's not to say I can't sell electric vehicles. I'm actually sat in another dealership actually in Carlisle, which has got actually a very high electric vehicle mix. But there is no question that we are not getting supply, not able to deliver petrol cars, and not in every franchise actually, but in a lot of franchises, which is reducing the size of the UK car market and putting the whole supply chain from manufacturing through to retail under quite considerable pressure, because we're trying to force something in that the market would not choose to do on its own.
Before we get into your view as one of Britain's biggest car dealers, Robert, somebody who lives and breathes the trade every single day, before we get your view on why EV sales are so much lower than expected at the moment, just tell us what the current situation, the ban on new petrol and diesel cars in 2035, which Labour may bring forward again to 2030. What's the impact of that ban incoming on the British car making industry, and in terms of the threat from overseas car makers who are making very, very subsidized EVs at much lower price. Of course, I'm thinking in particular of the Chinese.
The current state of affairs is, as you say, there will be no petrol or diesel or hybrid car sales from 2035. However, the Labour Party manifesto said they were going to bring that forward to 2030. In reality, this is nonsense discussion because the government, it was the Tory government that introduced the fining system that meant, forget the ban, by 2030, the current target of mix between electric vehicle and non-electric vehicle is 80%. I mean, it's near enough a ban. And in fact, that got right up my nose, if I'm brutally honest, because Rishi Sunak stood up, I think it was October last year, we're going to let consumers choose, we're going to let the market choose. And I was thinking, here we are, common sense.
It doesn't come in at 2030, it ramps up to then. I think a lot of people don't realise that.
Yeah, so I was expecting the transition and the targets and fines to reflect 2035. They didn't. They hit the industry very quickly. There will be manufacturers, I think, that pay fines of £15,000 a car to the government this year. Next year, I don't think the industry can get anywhere close to the percentages required by the government to avoid fines, unless, and I think this is probably the most likely option, there is rationing of petrol, diesel and hybrid cars.
Wow, that is a big statement for you to make. How widespread are your concerns across the UK automotive industry, Robert? Not just among the dealerships, but also the manufacturers?
Well, I think the manufacturers are concerned. The manufacturers are clearly global players with good links into the UK government. The UK has been a good place to make cars historically. There's been a lot of inward investment, a lot of jobs created. So I think the manufacturers are concerned, and I speak to the manufacturers. Clearly, we've got a lot of different manufacturers. But I actually think, though, that we're in such a position now, if you actually look what the manufacturers are saying, you've seen the head of Stellantis, Carlos Tavares, saying what's going on, how are we going to make cars in the UK when we've got this environment? Why am I subsidising UK consumers? Because actually the manufacturers are heavily discounting electric vehicles, heavily discounting, probably making losses on production cost in order to try and avoid the £15,000 fine. So clearly that is a problem. Now, it's a European-wide problem, but it is most extreme, I think, in the UK.
I mean, we've had key figures speaking out in the British car making industry, haven't we? Stellantis, who make electric vans up there on Ellesmere Port. You've had Lucia de Maio, CEO of Renault, said Europe's automotive industry could be issued with an enormous £12.6 billion equivalent fine for failing to meet these targets. That could bankrupt Europe's car industry. We've had the Italian government calling on the EU to pause the petrol car ban or risk, quotes, the industry's collapse. This debate is now really going mainstream.
It is, because there is a deep, deep concern that has been building over the past 12 months, really, that the consumer demand, which is there for electric vehicles, but it's not growing at the rate that the governments are imposing targets and fines. I mean, that's the fundamental point. You had Volkswagen, actually, at the weekend, did something quite unique for Volkswagen in its history, which is moot the closure of plants in Germany, which is, huge, actually.
So as a practitioner in the industry, as a seller of cars, Robert, why is the take-up of EVs lower than we expected? What's the reality on the ground in terms of whether consumers or not are buying these cars?
Well, I would say it's lower than the government's expected. But what did the government know? I think if they'd have spoken to a lot of people in the industry, adopting a new technology, if you go back to first principles, why would people choose a new technology? And historically, it's because it provides innumerable benefits over and above the old technology. And I mean, the steam engine was a good example. In 200 years since Stockton Darlington next year, and it was fairly obvious that steam engines beat horses. With electric vehicles, it's a little bit more complicated because the production costs and the energy requirements of producing the batteries actually means it's more expensive to produce a like-for-like car if it's electric, which is clearly problematic if you are trying to get private consumers to purchase a car. You're asking them to get a more expensive car.
The second biggest thing most people buy in their lives, their car.
Yes. And whereas there are fiscal incentives for company car drivers to buy an electric vehicle, much better from a company car tax point of view, the government have imposed all the sticks but not put any carrot on the table for retail customers. So they're faced with a new technology. Some people actually, if you've got a drive, they have to use public charging. Public charging is subject to a different rate of VAT. You can get charged up to 85 pence a kilowatt, whereas actually at home it's 8 pence a kilowatt. The charging infrastructure is getting better, but it's still, I don't think, good enough. And if there was a ramp up of electric vehicles, it would be inadequate. And then you've got your whole argument, which I know you're an expert in, is can this country produce enough electricity in the next 5 years debate? Well, if we're all going to drive electric vehicles, that's a lot of electricity.
On the offer to consumers, it's clear that the tax advantages of EVs are going to melt away because the government, if it's going to lose billions of pounds each year on petrol and diesel duty with both commercial and domestic motorists not paying that, they're going to have to get the money from somewhere. So obviously they're going to ramp up car tax charging. If you make the plunge towards an EV, it's not like you're going to have, years of cheap motoring because that incentive's already being whittled away.
This idea of road pricing and you pay per mile, you're right. I mean, if they're going to maintain their revenues, and let's be honest, fuel duty is a massive revenue to the exchequer, then that is going to cause them a problem. And actually, if my predictions are correct that the new car market is going to decline as a result of this regulatory interference in the natural market, the Treasury is going to get less VAT receipts. It's not well thought through at all. And I think we all accept that electric cars have many benefits, urban air pollution, just to name but one. But the Europeans have gone for 2035. As you know, this week, actually, Prime Minister of Italy said, why isn't it 2040, and give the industry more time to transition to it. Labour is still preparing to go back to 2030. And I actually, this week, written to the Secretary of State for Business asking for an urgent meeting to discuss this, because I think it is sufficiently important in terms of employment and the economy in the future, actually the automotive retail sector for one, that this is discussed with government to make them understand that actually if you align to Europe, which is an interesting concept, of 2035 and then taper the incentives and the stick of fines, billions of pounds worth of fines, out to 2035, the market would then have longer to adjust to what is a fundamental change in how it operates, really, in terms of production.
Both not just retail, but actual manufacturing too.
Oh, no, it's the manufacturers, I think, are the bigger issue, really. I mean, we're at the end of a major supply chain that starts with R&D, goes through production plants and comes out the other side to retail. But we're all one industry. And I think the government will have to respond to this, or there will be significant consumer problems of, well, why can't I have one? And that's a very good question. Why can't you have a petrol car in 2029? And the answer is people will not be able to afford to supply one. And actually, you can quite clearly see what's going to happen, which is that the price charged for petrol vehicles will go up because they'll have scarcity.
And the consumer will end up paying part of the fine, obviously. So the government collects about 25 billion quid a year in fuel duty. That's equivalent to 3 or 4p on the basic rate of income tax. They're going to have to get that money from somewhere. What do you think of the fact, Robert? And I want to ask you about where you think the trade unions are at the moment. We've seen the trade unions get very bolshy at the TUC conference in terms of Labour's policies that will effectively end, many commercial analysts think, North Sea oil drilling, of course, has tens of thousands of good jobs involved there. But what do you think about the government's decision in principle to bet the ranch on EV, to make EV the chosen technology? Is it a blind alley? Are there better alternatives?
It does beg the question why the state has decided on one technology. And actually, interestingly, a technology where the Europeans are probably not at a competitive advantage, and China certainly probably is at a competitive advantage with regards to electric vehicle production, which actually, if you're trying to grow the European or the UK economy, is a rather odd decision. And unfortunately, because of the Climate Change Act and the net zero push, Yes, everybody understands that ultimately electric vehicles might be the way to go. But actually, there are going to be some interesting technological changes in the next 20 years. You can't say they're going to come through. Hydrogen cars, some people say they could come through, some people they couldn't. Certainly a lot of R&D going in. E-fuels, very interesting, actually. E-fuels, expensive at the moment, but with scale, could it be put in place? And certainly some people think it could be. To be honest with you, petrol cars are supremely efficient, particularly when allied to hybrids. The CO2 on them is fairly exceptional, to be honest with you. So I think it would be very embarrassing for the powers that be to do a backtrack. But I suspect reality is going to be that if they don't, there's going to be some severe consequences, actually.
You mentioned e-fuels there. They're synthetic fuels that work in internal combustion engines. China now is producing almost 60% of all EVs made in the world, many of them heavily subsidized by the Chinese government in order to grab market share, as Europe in particular imposes this ban in 2035 and maybe in 2030 in our case, Robert. Where are the trade unions on this? What political turmoil do you think this is going to cause if Ed Miliband prevails?
Ed Miliband's just one element, isn't he? I mean, you've got the Treasury, you've got the Business Department, and you've got the Net Zero Department, and you've got the Transport Department. So there's 4 departments involved in the debate. I imagine the trade unions will be looking at it and thinking, what does this mean for the wider UK economy and what's it mean for jobs? Interestingly, we are currently, if you take North America and Europe, we are the only country with no tariffs on Chinese vehicles imported. That's an interesting debate because actually a lot of the European manufacturers are making cars in China and would be subject to any tariffs that were put in place. But it's a unique position the UK now finds itself in with regards to tariffs. And I think that's somewhat tied up in this debate on electric vehicles because the Chinese, in all fairness, have some very good technology, have scale in terms of production of electric vehicles. I think I'm right in saying by 2025, 70% of all electric vehicle batteries will be made in China. And clearly, you need a battery for every car. So it's quite a complex industry with a lot of complex dynamics. And I imagine the trade unions will be wanting to protect jobs, I would imagine.
Just finally, Robert, this is Planet Normal. Just tell us a little bit about yourself briefly, how you made your way in business and why you are such a champion, as I know you are, of the northeast of England.
I don't actually come from the northeast of England. I actually come from Lancashire. But I moved to the northeast 23 years ago to actually join the car industry up there and the automotive retail industry. And then in 2006, a small group of us based in the northeast decided to start a company up, which was Vertu Motors. We actually used the A market. I'm a great fan of the City of London. I'm a great fan of the stock market. We actually went with a PowerPoint presentation with no business whatsoever to persuade investors to give us money to go and buy some car dealerships. And we came home with £26 million.
And why the northeast?
The northeast is a fantastic place to do business. The work ethic, actually, of the people in the northeast is brilliant. There's a deep expertise in car retailing. Many of the historic companies of our sector heralded from the northeast. Cowies from Sunderland, Reg Vardy from Sunderland. Go further into North Yorkshire and you've got Bramall's, great historic names. Actually, if you look at our business, some of our key directors who started the company with us, actually some of them still with us, are ex-coal miners. So one of my directors who heads up 4 of my operating divisions was a health and safety man down the mine in Sunderland. So there's a real deep passion actually in the northeast. We've obviously got the Nissan car plant as well, which is a massive benefit to the economy of the northeast. And when we decided to start the company, we lived in the northeast. I actually believe from an economic development standpoint that having regionally based PLCs is critical actually, because that's where the high powered jobs are. That's where the professionals like the lawyers and accountants. And we've lost a lot of that in the UK. There's been a real drift away from the region. So we are now, I think, the largest company by turnover in the northeast. We employ 7,500 people across the UK, and we employ 500 people in Gateshead. And I think, I really want to see the regions of Britain do very, very well. And I think in a small way, we've done our bit, actually. And I don't want to see government mandates undermine, our business or the other business in the sector. We've grown over 17 years. I've been chief exec for 17 years, which is actually quite unique in public markets, if I'm honest. And we've got a good future if actually governments were sensible.
Well, Robert, it's a phenomenal achievement. You're the epitome of UK entrepreneurial energy. Great to have you here with us on Planet Normal.
Pleasure.
I'm stunned, Liam. I mean, listen to what Robert Forrester was telling us. The British public being coerced into buying vehicles they don't particularly want to buy for very good reasons, because, as Robert made the good point, all advances in industry and technology have been driven because the products are provably better and more economical than what's gone before. But we are actually being coerced into buying things which are not as economical and not as good. And guess what? We haven't even got enough electricity for the electric vehicles we've got now. We're certainly not going to have enough electricity for the electric vehicles that Ed Miliband thinks we're going to have by 2030. It's an act of national suicide. It's absolutely insane. Also, that this really mad Miliband man can boast that we are world leaders in net zero. What does that even mean? And we you alluded to Port Albert in my part of the country, which is going to lose thousands of jobs with an absolute catastrophic effect on the town and the surrounding area. For what? We're not going to be producing steel. I'd just like to say to Planet Normal listeners, I'm in regular touch now with Professor Peter Edwards, a great professor of chemistry at Oxford, who's telling me about the drawbacks of these lithium batteries. And Peter emailed me this week in response to Ed Miliband. Damn awful. We will end up as theme park Britain with all our heavy industry gone, stuff manufactured and brought in from overseas, and of course the CO2 emissions shipped over there. And they'll gloat about us getting to net zero. I keep telling these characters that CO2 was correctly termed by Primo Levi the aerial form of carbon. It simply doesn't respect boundaries. So what they're trying to do, Liam, it doesn't make any sense, and it's going to punish the ordinary working people of our country.
As you say, in Port Talbot, the closure of blast furnaces means that the UK won't be able to make any high-grade, what we call virgin steel, used in some industrial situations. We'll just be making steel in arc furnaces out of scrap metal, which is very, very different. And I think also, here's a prediction, Allison. I don't think this 2035 ban is going to be brought forward in the UK's 2030, because increasingly the car industry is going to start speaking out, and they are mighty, mighty employers, a powerful set of interests. And a lot of the public will chime in with their concerns about this. I don't even think the 2035 ban is going to hold across the European Union, because the European car industry is just not ready to produce EVs at this scale. So much of the market will succumb to China, which not only produces now over half of all these EVs in the world, as I said in that interview, it also has 90% of the production capacity of the rare earths that go into the batteries that you spoke about. This is a really complex policy area, but I think now the real details of some of these aspects of net zero are coming to the fore. And similarly, the UK, as Ed Miliband alluded to, does have a high share of renewables in its electricity generation mix. Coal's gone from 40% of our electricity generation to practically zero over the last 2 decades. Renewables is up at between 30 and 45%, depending on the day. But of course, we have that high renewable share, but we also have pretty much the most expensive domestic electricity in Europe, even though we have a high renewable share. So again, unless net zero is shown to provide benefits for consumers soon, not just punishing drawbacks for consumers, it's going to be far, far harder for the political class to keep pushing this agenda forward, given the impact on ordinary people. Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, don't we, Allison? The citizens of Planet Normal.
And here's a very good example from Keeley. Hi, Allison and Liam. I was a privileged Planet Normal mug winner just over 3 years ago when I wrote to you about my plan to leave the UK and emigrate to New Zealand with my Kiwi husband and 3 boys. I was born very working class, says Keeley, a council estate kid born in 1974, who managed to be the first person in my family to go to university. I did an English degree, but I've worked as a senior finance executive for many years, and I've paid a significant sum in taxes in the UK. I'm a good all-rounder who can do the numbers and the communication. My boys are clever, and they're likely to be net contributors in whichever tax system they pay into. We left the UK on the 31st of July 2021 in floods of tears. We were heartbroken to leave our family and friends in our beautiful Yorkshire village, but my husband and I were convinced that the UK was buggered. I could be more coarse, says Keeley. The reasons we chose to leave my beloved country are legion. In short, 1, ruinous lockdown policy. I lost all trust in our institutions. 2, unfettered immigration, reducing GDP per capita, hitting the working class the hardest. I know from my childhood and the successive waves of immigrants in Leeds, the big Irish community, the Caribbean Windrush generation, what good integration looks like. We did it then. It's not like that now. It's out of control. 3, the arrogance of our political parasitic elite, the disregard for the democratic mandate given to them both from the Brexit vote and the 2019 election. 4, the uniparty on both sides of the Commons and a rampant Labour government. I can well remember the 70s of my childhood. As for New Zealand, says Keeley, we got here and had to live through the Jacinda COVID tyranny. We have an MMP system here, and jackpoot Jacinda is now gone. At the moment, we've got a coalition government, including some minority right-of-centre parties voted in by an electorate determined to get answers about the COVID years and roll back woke ideologies. I feel more represented. I miss my country. It is an ache I cannot salve. The memories that I most treasure and wish I could bring to pass are about a country and a people from a bygone era. That country is gone, and I despise the people responsible left and right. I damn them all. I would have stayed to try and be part of a movement to punish them, but in the end, I have to give my boys a better chance for the future, so I left. Thank God my mum and dad are not here to see what happened to our beautiful island. My sisters, my brother, nieces and nephews are still in the UK. I wish I could wrap them up and whisk them to New Zealand too. For now, it is a far nicer place. Sending you my heartfelt thanks for all that you both do. Keeley.
This is from Martin. Dear Allison and Liam, in last week's incisive Planet Normal interview with Ian Cox, we heard of the incompetence and worse shown by those in whom we trusted. The fact that 247 individuals are personally criticised in the Grenfell inquiry report, with at least 5 having been ennobled or otherwise awarded since the tragedy, says it all. Many of those in the fire safety community, including Ian and his former colleagues in the fire and rescue services, want much wider recognition of the role of fire sprinklers, says Martin, in preventing serious injuries and property damage in high-rise and other high-risk properties, such as hospitals, schools, student halls, warehouses, and all substantial buildings with combustible construction. Exactly a year to the day after the fire at Grenfell Tower, another broke out in a flat on the 12th floor of a tower block in London. It was contained to the flat by sprinklers with no injuries, no serious damage, and no front-page news stories. This is an area of fire safety regulation that the UK is far behind the US, Australia, much of Asia, and many European countries. As Ian mentioned, protecting property with sprinklers also saves lives, as well as avoiding the disruption to children's education caused by the loss of a school, to healthcare. There are on average 4 hospital fires a day in the NHS, says Martin, or to the economy from shortage of products following serious warehouse fires. Sprinklers aren't mentioned at all in Sir Martin Moore-Bick's Phase 2 report, and only briefly in Phase 1, as no evidence was heard on the subject, perhaps because the appropriate questions weren't asked, and therefore no recommendations made for the widespread use of sprinklers in the UK. This can now be corrected by a concerted partnership between the new government, local authorities, fire safety experts, housing providers, developers, builders, and the business community to install and retrofit sprinklers in all high-risk buildings. With Matt Rack of the Fire Brigade Union being elected as president of the TUC, the unions might now also add their weight to the cause. Then it's sure to go through. With best regards, Martin. What a well-informed email. Crikey.
This is from Nicola. Hello, both. When I was listening to your recent podcast, you touched on the subject of Headmistress Ruth Perry committing suicide after receiving her school's Ofsted report. After losing my husband through suicide, I'd be grateful if you're covering a similar subject in the future. Could you please refer to a death this way as taking their life rather than committing suicide, which implies a crime? I love listening to your show. Thank you, Nicola. Well, Nicola, I just want to say that Liam and I would never want to be insensitive at all. So we'll absolutely bear that in mind going forward. So glad that you are a listener.
Point taken. Point very, very well made.
Yes. Couple of critics of my
Steady.
Fatty's little helper. Allison, says Colin, I can't believe after COVID you're falling for this SH1T. Drugs over nutrition.
Go on, Colin. Get in there, son.
Customers for life isn't about good health, it's about profit. I do not believe there is a single physician who has not been corrupted by Big Pharma. You are in need of help. Much of it psychiatric.
Oh my God.
You're right. Take that chocolate away. Evidenced by your use of a drug to literally waste you away. Eat healthy, exercise regularly, talk to people, stay away from social media, get away from London. It's an SH1T hole. Come home, says Colin. Love and best wishes from Wales. Right, well, we've had a few of those, but this is Sally. I've been taking Manjaro since March. 2.5 stone is gone. Now at the age of 61, I've returned to my premenopause weight. I no longer wake up in the night hating my body. I just bought a fab red sequin dress in size 10, says Sally, and I feel amazing. It's not cheating, just taking control of your health. I've told friends and family, and actually all have been very positive and encouraging. I might get myself a red sequin dress for Christmas, Sally, see if I can get into it.
Well, I'd like to give email of the week to Colin, but I dare not, because you're going to the Planet Normal inbox and get his postal address and go round and clobber him.
You can. You know how much I like being told off by my fellow countrymen.
Just before we go, Allison, Planet Normal would like to pay tribute to our wonderful Telegraph colleague, David Knowles, who passed away at the weekend. A hugely talented journalist and broadcaster, David launched and presented the Telegraph's Ukraine the Latest podcast, dedicated to giving a voice to those directly affected by war in Ukraine, which since launching in early 2022, the podcast has achieved around 100 million downloads. David was a much-loved colleague and friend to everyone who worked with him. His loss will be felt not just by us here at Planet Normal and across the Telegraph, but given the reach and impact of David's journalism, his loss will be felt across the world.
It's been a huge shock, Liam, because David was so young and so gifted. But what really struck me was reading the unbelievable tributes. I mean, thousands of tributes have flowed in from all around the world. And they not only identify what a fantastic journalist this still young man was, but just an exceptional human being. So David Knowles, R.I.P.
And I know our sentiments are shared, aren't they, by our excellent producers
who worked with him.
Isabel Bajard, Cass Ho, and of course, Louisa Wells. And so that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week. Alison, it's your turn. Are you going to get Colin to risk it?
Well, I thought Keely's email was exceptional, but she's in New Zealand and
she's already got a mug.
We're stingy, so we can't afford the postage. So, Colin, yes.
God,
yes.
If you dare, send us an email to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk, put in the subject heading mug winner and give us your postal address. Maybe we can encrypt it so co-pilot Pearson can't actually punch in your postcode to her phone and buy herself a train ticket.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, please do leave us a rating if you haven't already, and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you happen to manage to listen to me and the co-pilot. It really does help others to find us so the wonderful Planet Normal family can grow.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever To our producers, Isabel Bajard, Cass Ho, and Louisa Wells, stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.